If you guys pay attention to the headlines the last few weeks, it's been pretty scary, right? On November 1st, they are going to be cutting off food to 42 million Americans, the end of SNAP. There will be gnawing and gnashing of teeth, riots in the streets, massive social unrest. Protect your farms, by the way, because all of these people are going to be coming to you looking for food. Whether you have food or not, they just assume you live on a farm and therefore you must have food, which isn't exactly the case. If the government shutdown continues past November 1st, there will be no SNAP benefits. It all sounds pretty freaking scary. And the language is pretty alarmist. And I think that there's actually a serious risk that's behind all of it. A risk that affects clearly tens of millions of Americans, 12.3% of the population. Sit on that for a second. 12.3% of the American population, I don't know if they're all citizens, depend on the government to pay their grocery store bill. It's 41.7 million people every single month. But right now, the federal government is in gridlock and all those people may be starving after November 1st. I mean, the shutdown that started October 1st is starting to get pretty messy, isn't it? The USDA went as far as sending out a letter to states just last week or earlier this week, last week, basically saying that as of November 1st, there won't be any more money to pay for SNAP benefits. And that's why everybody on social media is saying there's going to be riots, there's going to be massive social unrest, there's going to be a lot of starving people out there. This is cruel. Now, before I get further into this video, let me just reassure you that that is not likely going to happen for numerous reasons, which I will discuss. But it does, to me, ring alarm bells. Almost 13% of the US population is depending on the government to pay their grocery store bills. You want to know what's really strange about these statistics is that if you look at in cities, I think the average is about 10% of people. It's not the same everywhere. If you go to New Mexico, for example, 21% of the people in New Mexico depend on the government to pay their grocery bill. In Utah, it's only 4.8%. But it just in overall estimate numbers, about 10% of people living in metro areas depend on the government to pay their grocery bill. What is really strange is that it's up over 16% in rural areas. The disconnect there is astonishing to me. If you live in a rural area, don't you have extra land? Can't you grow some food on your own? And again, it's not really that simple. So we're going to talk a little bit about that here in just a second. But first of all, let's talk about why you probably don't have to worry that much about SNAP November 1st. Number one, SNAP is a mandatory entitlement program. What that means is that anybody in the United States, it should be citizens, but apparently it's anybody these days, anybody in the United States who's below a certain income threshold, those of you who aren't here legally, you probably don't report it, so they wouldn't know, is entitled and has a certain family size. You know, there's a few other rules in there, but those people are entitled to have the government pay their grocery store bill through the SNAP program. And those SNAP benefits will fluctuate depending on all the different categories and boxes that you check or don't check. So that makes SNAP a mandatory spending program, but there is a catch. All of the dollars that have been allocated to SNAP come from an annual appropriations bill from Congress. That's why our government is shut down, is because they haven't passed one. So what happens is even though the spending is mandatory, the funds just aren't there anymore. So they can't spend the money. And that's why people are saying that SNAP will end November 1st. It won't end, it's just kind of stuck. It can't go anywhere because it doesn't have any money left in the bank account. But that's not entirely true either. The USDA actually has contingency money that they could continue to pay SNAP benefits out for several weeks if they wanted to, maybe even an entire month. States will be able to continue on with the program even after November 1st. They haven't run out of that contingency money. They haven't even tapped into it yet because when we went into the shutdown October 1st, the October SNAP benefits were already in the budget. Now here's another thing, this is common sense, but both parties have routinely done whatever they could do to prevent a food crisis, because if you prevent a food crisis, you will most likely have an uprising in the streets, riots, and it's just cruel. You know, when you have these people dependent on you because you wanted them dependent on you, and you have to continue to take care of them. And you can't just decide one day, oh, well, we can't agree, so we're just not going to provide the payments to you anymore. You're out. That's not how it works. It's political suicide. So neither political party is going to let it get to the point where they don't have some sort of funding contingency put in place for SNAP benefits. They're not going to allow that to happen. So you can rest assured that that is most likely not going to happen. You could also rest assured that the contingency funds that the USDA has will still be able to provide SNAP benefits, and they will most likely continue to supply SNAP benefits. But you know, as this government shutdown continues, I mean, you could see less SNAP benefits. You could see, you know, some people who might be in the upper tiers all of a sudden not get SNAP benefits because they're going to try and stretch those contingency dollars. They've got to try and make something work. But it's not going to be completely shut off for over 42 million Americans. That's the hyperbole that you hear on the news these days. And I think that hyperbole is out there. And honestly, I think that we'll probably have a solution here in Congress this week that will unlock the government, because the No Kings protests are over. And everybody knows that a lot of this stuff is for optics. Get people riled up, send them to the streets, get them wild. All right, so let me get back to what this really shows us about America. This is what I find concerning. Is that over 12, maybe 13% of the US population is depending on the government to pay for their food. The rural population of America is more dependent on the government paying for their food than the populations you see in cities and metro areas. And I think that that's something that surprises people, because they think, you know, can you go out, can you grow food? You've got land, you've got space. And while land is there, not all land is created equal. A lot of rural areas, like the area we live, has really rocky soil. You can't just plant directly into the soil. Our land is actually better off as ranch lands, letting animals kind of graze on the grasses that can naturally grow in this environment. But trying to grow food in this dirt is actually pretty hard. It's clay, rock, yuck. It takes tools, it takes knowledge, it takes skills, it takes physical ability in order to grow your own food. And you know, the other thing is you have to think about is that a lot of these people are out in these areas renting a trailer from somebody, but they don't have land tenancy, which means that they don't have the ability to use necessarily the land. They just live out in these areas and you know, but they don't have use of that space. You don't have a right to grow food, according to a lot of states, a lot of homeowners associations. I've done videos on this, and it's gotten to the point where the one state that does have in their state constitution the right to grow food, you have a couple in court having to argue to keep their chickens that they raise to grow food. I think we all know that in rural areas you have this aging population, okay? That a lot of people living in rural areas are getting older and older. The younger generations are moving away. You know, as technology has grown, as our communications have grown, number one, young people have found themselves kind of completely hypnotized by what's on their cell phone. They're not out doing the things that they used to do. They're not out being creative. They're not out learning farm mechanics. They're not out learning kind of the necessities of growing food and living. So it's not second nature to them like it used to be, maybe back in the 40s, 50s, 60s. I mean, even in the 70s, you still had a lot of families who had homesteads whose kids helped raise their food, and they didn't rely so heavily on grocery stores to feed them. But as we entered this technological age, there's so many distractions, TV shows. By the time the kids are at an age where they need to start figuring out what they do, they don't even know how to live in the country anymore. They don't know how to chop wood. So what they do is they move into the city where they feel like they have more opportunities, where they feel like they have more confidence to succeed, where there's opportunities with working with computers and electronics, where there's opportunities to act or to, you know what I mean? There's just, to them, there's more opportunities moving elsewhere. But you know, my wife and I and our nonprofit, we started a rural youth development fund, and part of it was to address this issue, to help kids learn life skills, learn outdoor survival skills, outdoor leadership skills, how to raise animals, how to work with animals, how to farm. Rebuilding these skills and rebuilding that lifestyle in our youth. Because if we don't do it, they're all going to leave. And that's what we've seen. We've seen the youth leave. And as the youth leaves, we've seen families buckle, where a family back in the 40s and 50s may have stuck around. This isn't that long ago, if you think about it. They would have stuck around. They would have cared for each other. The elderly would have been cared for by their kids, just as they helped care for their kids growing up. You didn't have necessarily people meeting each other across the country, getting married and running away somewhere. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that at all. My wife is from Colorado. I grew up in Florida. I mean, we come from very different points of the earth. Some would say I'm from Mars and she's from Venus. We have a great relationship. And I think every time, a young couple gets married, they truly are starting a new family, and that should be their focus. But there's still something to, the older days when families did somewhat stick together. They stuck near each other. They helped with each other. If you had some of these elderly individuals who are living in rural areas still, if you had somebody out there tending to the gardens, helping with that stuff, they probably wouldn't be relying on SNAP, not to the extent that they are right now. And so this is a cycle that has started up. The other big problem that I see in rural areas, and why 16% of the rural population is dependent on SNAP programs, is the fact that you don't really even have small farms anymore. I mean, we have small farms, but they're shutting down every single day. They don't make enough money to stay operable. It's more of a hobby. It's an expensive hobby. You don't make money at it. And so what ends up happening is, instead of having, the local farmer who's feeding 10 families, the multiple homesteads who are supplying other types of crops, diversity into the food supply, what you have are these global corporations who own all the farmland. People like Bill Gates, who just own thousands and thousands and thousands of acres of farmland. And then they're shipping off everything that they farm, turning it into products, throwing it on grocery store shelves. And those products are highly processed because they have to create some sort of shelf life to it. I used to tell everybody that I'm so well preserved because of how many preservatives I eat. That was a joke, by the way. You can laugh. My point is that all of these things have contributed to 16% of the rural population living off of SNAP. It's not a moral issue of those people. What it is it's a circumstantial thing of where our society has gone, where our rural economies have gone. It's actually an irony that most of the food deserts in the United States are in rural areas. I mean, when we were helping, with Hurricane Helene relief, we were doing a lot of work up in the mountains. You couldn't go to a normal grocery store up there. You had the places that they had available to them. All they had was processed food on the shelves. It's completely unhealthy. Small town grocery stores have completely disappeared. People have to drive 30, 40 miles to get to a normal grocery store these days. Anyway, so you have, the youth moving away from the area. You have the aging population in those areas. You have things like, grocery stores consolidating, closing down, making it more expensive just to even go and get the food. And on top of that, you have the same thing happening with schools, with healthcare. Healthcare companies are constantly merging, then eventually moving out to wherever the hospital is. I think it's about a 30, 40-minute drive to a hospital around here. It doesn't make a difference to me. I've never even had a shot in my life. But I'm just saying, it makes life difficult. They don't want you in rural areas anymore. They really don't. But SNAP basically kind of fills that gap in those areas. I don't know, I found it interesting, and I went on this kind of mental dive when I was reading these headlines, because I was like, first of all, the government's going to open back up now that the No Kings protests are over. It's political suicide to let the SNAP program go. So they're not going to let that go. Plus there's contingency money in there. They're not just going to say on November 1st, this is the end of SNAP. There might be some changes to it, things that people don't like for a very short period of time. But what I found just astonishing was the number of people reliant on the government to pay their grocery store bill. And then realizing that reliance is bigger in rural areas than metro areas. I mean, these are astonishing numbers to me. My wife said, given the economy, she's not surprised. I think in the short term, Congress has to pass some sort of continuance resolution for funding. I mean, that's going to have to happen. They're going to do it regardless. You're not going to have these things shut down and come back here and call me a fool if I'm wrong. In the long term, there's a bigger problem that we need to fix here. And I think that the way we fix it is we start supporting small and medium farmers. We put them as a policy first. And when we start having high beef prices, instead of importing billions of pounds of beef from places like Argentina and Brazil, I did a video on this the other day, we allow the rural economy to catch up to it, to invest, to see a return on their investment. You know, part of the reason why we have a shortage of beef in the US right now is that you had a period of time where there was an oversupply. And it was not possible for ranchers to make money growing beef based on how much supply there was in the market. You had a lot of people leave the industry, just flat out leave it. You had kids that were moving away from rural areas that said, you know, I don't want to run my family ranch because I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to keep a bunch of animals alive and barely feeding my family, because that is the situation that we were in, an overproduction situation where we just had too much supply. Yes, the droughts have had some impacts, but a lot of it has to do with rural economy. When the supply drops like it has, prices soar. It's not great for the consumers. It's never great for the consumers. Everybody's so worried about the consumers consuming more. And when their most basic need, which is food, goes up, they spend less on electronics and all the other things that they want you spending money on. So they have to fix that situation. They rush to fix it. But if they don't fix that situation, if they don't rush to fix it, what you get is a bunch of people living in these rural areas, farmers, ranchers, who start making investments to convert to more productivity. And that starts the cycle again. If you don't allow that to happen, it just completely fails. And that's the direction that we've been heading in for years. I think that they need to do more to open more and more local processing plants so that more farmers have access to their neighbors, to their market. They need to make it easier for farmers to sell directly to consumers. And they should start tying SNAP benefits to supporting local small and medium-sized farms. Allow them to take SNAP benefits. If you're going to use SNAP because our rural economies have fallen apart, at least use it to help rebuild them so that people don't have to constantly be reliant on the government dollar, taxpayers. I mean, it's just crazy. 42 million people in the United States of America rely on the government to pay their grocery store bill. They're entitled to it, whether they're a citizen or not, apparently. And what's crazy about it is that many of these people live in the same spaces that were once used to feed this country. That's the irony of it. So while the headlines are all screaming the sky is falling and SNAP ends November 1st, that's not true. That's not entirely true at all. It's never going to really end that way. It's not just going to be a sudden cutoff someday. There are resources to keep it going. But those alarming headlines bring up a much bigger, in my view, a much bigger and alarming situation. And that's the situation of our food supply and where we are right now. I believe personally that we are heading towards a period of time where there will be massive food shortages. It's a cyclical thing. We've seen it throughout history. And I'm talking about natural climate cycles that are going to hinder our food supply. We're already seeing it. If you look around you, we're already seeing it. That's another reason why we have such a low beef supply, is because of the droughts that we've been experiencing, water supply issues that we've been experiencing, although I would argue that a lot of that has to do with data centers as well. And then you have these periods of time, it's not just here, it's all around the world, which creates an environment around the world that is unsafe, that's trigger happy. We are in, I guess they'd call it World War IV because World War III was the Cold War, but we are in a global conflict right now, a global fight for power. If that conflict turns into hot wars, it already has been turning into hot wars, but if it grows, what are we going to do? How are we going to supply ourselves with food? We already rely on other countries to feed us, and then we rely on the government to pay that bill. We are not living in a period of time like World War II, when you had family homesteads that stepped up, that were able to provide food to their community. We're not living in that time anymore when people would pull together their scraps to feed some pigs so that they'd have some protein. We're not living in a time where people came together and worked together to put up a barn to milk a cow. We are living in times when people are so disconnected with their basic needs that all it's going to take is one massive catastrophe and the whole thing falls apart. COVID was a perfect example of it. Small farms stepped up during COVID. They did a good job of supplying food to their local communities. And the lockdown wasn't that bad. As you've seen from watching the war in Ukraine, the war in Gaza, when these things break out, they go for years, and they're much more drastic. Add that to all of the changes and the cycles that we're experiencing with our planet. It wouldn't surprise me if within the next 5 years, we see something major happen. And we don't have the skill set, we don't have the knowledge, we don't have the wherewithal that we once had to be able to feed our country. That's what scares me. That, when I read these numbers, when I read these headlines, that's where my mind goes. Holy cow, there's a lot of people on SNAP. What is going to happen to this world when everything just falls apart? Because it has in the past. It does it over and over and over again. And we're like the least prepared that we have ever been, the least. There are billions of people on this planet, guys. There will be gnawing and gnashing of teeth. We've got to fix this system now. We've got to make big steps to fix this system pronto.